Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but they left the public completely divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases, guys. These are the ones where the facts might seem clear, but the truth, that's another story. Because of their nature, these cases are difficult to decide. They leave people at odds with each other. The court has made its big ruling, but now what do you think? In this episode of True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion, we're going to head to a small town in Missouri to examine the infamous case of Ken McElroy, the man who seemed to terrorize his community for years, only to be gunned down in broad daylight, right in front of dozens of witnesses, none of whom ever came forward. McElroy's reign of intimidation and violence in the town of Skidmore is the stuff of legend. From assault to arson, he was accused of countless crimes, but somehow he always slipped through the legal cracks. But that all came to an end in 1981 when McElroy was shot dead while sitting in his truck. His murder was witnessed by over 40 people, but to this day, no one has ever been charged. Was this an act of vigilante justice by a town that had finally had enough? Or was this a failure of the legal system that drove ordinary people to do the unthinkable? In this episode, we're going to break down the facts of McElroy's life and death and ask the question, was this murder justified, or did the town of Skidmore cross the line into lawlessness? Let's dive into one of the most controversial cases of mob justice in modern American history. Ken McElroy. He was not your average criminal. Okay, for decades, this guy seemed to exist above the law in small farming community of Skidmore, Missouri. McElroy was a man who inspired fear in pretty much everyone he encountered, and his rap sheet reflected a history of intimidation and violence and manipulation. Charged with, well, everything from theft to arson to attempted murder, McElroy somehow managed to evade serious punishment time and time again. His strategy? Well, it was simple. He wielded fear like a weapon. And come on, guys, we all know fear is so strong. I mean, by threatening and bullying anyone who dared to stand against him, McElroy made sure that witnesses refused to testify, that juries would be intimidated, and that justice overall was just delayed or flat out denied. But in July of 1981, Ken McElroy's reign of terror came to a sudden and violent end. On a quiet summer morning, he was shot dead in broad daylight while sitting in his truck outside a local bar. More than 40 people witnessed the shooting. And yet, to this day, not a single person has been charged with his murder. The silence from the witnesses was deafening, raising one of the most important and controversial questions in modern American justice. Was Ken McElroy's death an act of justified vigilante justice? Or was this just flat out cold-blooded murder? McElroy's death was the climax of years of pent-up frustration and fear within the town. He was notorious for terrorizing residents with his volatile temper and violent behavior. He had shot a man, assaulted numerous people, and was even rumored to have been involved in the death of animals and property destruction. But it was his latest crime, shooting grocer Ernest Bowenkamp in the neck, that appeared to have been the final straw for the people of Skidmore. Though McElroy was convicted for the shooting, he was released on bail pending appeal and returned to town with a rifle sitting outside the local tavern as if just daring anyone to challenge him. The situation was pretty much just unbearable for the residents of Skidmore. Here was a man who had shot an innocent person in cold blood. Yet there he was, free to walk the streets as if nothing had happened. Some feared for their lives and others for their property. But above all, they feared that the law would once again fail to deliver justice. And that fear, well, it turned into desperation. And it was on that fateful morning in July of 81 that things finally boiled over. While McElroy sat in his truck with his wife, multiple shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, McElroy lay dead, but no one would admit to pulling the trigger. And here's where the debate begins. Was McElroy's murder the result of a community pushed to the breaking point? A desperate act of vigilante justice carried out by people who believed the legal system had failed them? Or was this something darker, an unlawful killing driven by mob mentality and vengeance? I mean, there are those that argue that McElroy, that guy had it coming, that after years of terrorizing his neighbors, he got exactly what he deserved. But others believed that no matter how terrible a person might be, taking the law into your hands, it's not justified. This is a case that goes beyond the murder itself. It touches on deeper issues of justice, accountability, and the role of law in society. When the legal system fails, do citizens have the right to take matters into their own hands? Or does vigilante justice undermine the very foundations of law and order? These are questions that have sparked heated debates, not just in Skidmore, but across the country. In this episode, we're going to dive deep into the events leading up to McElroy's murder, the dynamics within the town, and the legal system's role, or lack thereof, in protecting its citizens. And as we explore these questions, I ask you, the listeners, to consider, where do you draw the line between justice and revenge? Was Ken McElroy's death a necessary act to restore peace in a terrorized community? Or did the town of Skidmore cross a line that should never have been crossed? Ken Rex McElroy. He was the kind of man who seemed larger than life, and not because of his charm or his accomplishments, but because of the fear that he inspired in his neighbors. This guy was born in 1934. He grew up in Kansas before moving to the small town of Skidmore, Missouri, where Ken quickly established himself as a local menace. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade, and from then on, it seemed like McElroy was always looking for trouble, whether it was cattle rustling, theft, intimidation. He had a reputation for doing whatever he wanted without facing any consequences. By the time Ken is in his 40s, he had been accused of nearly 24 felonies, including arson, burglary, and assault. Yet time and time again, this guy managed to avoid any serious punishment. McElroy's ability to escape justice was not a coincidence. He had a habit of intimidating witnesses into silence. Those who dared to testify against him often found themselves the target of his rage. He would follow them, show up at their homes in the dead of night, and even threaten their families. It wasn't long before the people of Skidmore learned that it was safer to keep quiet than to stand up to Ken McElroy. The result was a community living in fear, a fear that stretched far beyond McElroy's immediate victims. One of the reasons McElroy was able to operate with impunity was his ability to manipulate the legal system. He had a sharp sense of how to exploit the rules to his own advantage, often hiring top tier attorneys who knew all about how to stall and delay and muddy the waters in court. Even when charges were brought against him, McElroy's lawyers would file endless motions, dragging out cases and making it nearly impossible for the prosecution to succeed. His legal strategy was simple: overwhelm the system, wear down his opponents, and it all worked, time and time again. McElroy managed to avoid serious jail time, and each victory, it only made him more brazen. But McElroy's most infamous crime was still to come. In 1980, a confrontation with a local grocer named Ernest Bowenkamp escalated into violence. The dispute started over something trivial. McElroy's children had been accused of stealing candy from Bowenkamp's store. McElroy, as was his nature, refused to let it go. He began harassing the Bowenkamp family, driving by their home, making threats, and intimidating anyone who got in his way. The situation reached a boiling point when McElroy shot Bowenkamp in the neck with a shotgun. Remarkably, Bowenkamp survived the attack, but the message was clear: no one was safe from McElroy's wrath. McElroy was arrested and charged with attempted murder. But even then, the justice system seemed incapable of stopping him. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, McElroy was released on bail while awaiting appeal. And instead of keeping a low profile, he returned to Skidmore and continued to intimidate the townspeople. Armed with a rifle, McElroy would park his truck outside Bowenkamp's grocery store, staring down anyone who dared to cross his path. It was a terrifying display of power, and the townspeople felt helpless. As McElroy continued to flaunt his freedom, the frustration in Skidmore began to mount. The residents had tried everything they could to bring him to justice, but the system had failed them at every turn. Many in the town believed it was only a matter of time before McElroy struck again, and they feared for their own safety and the safety of their loved ones. The tension in the air was palpable, and people began to whisper about taking matters into their own hands. On July 10th, in 1981, that tension, it finally snapped. McElroy was sitting in his truck outside the D&G Tavern in downtown Skidmore, just as he had done many times before. But this time something was different. As McElroy sat there with his wife, Trina, multiple gunshots rang out. McElroy was shot by several bullets, and within moments he was dead. The shots came from several directions, suggesting that more than one person had been involved in this shooting. And yet, despite the fact that more than 40 people were present at the scene, not one person came forward to identify the gunman. In the immediate aftermath of McElroy's death, law enforcement launched an investigation. But it quickly became clear that no one in Skidmore was willing to talk. The witnesses, many of whom had been terrorized by McElroy for years, remained silent. No one admitted to pulling the trigger, and no one offered any useful information about who might have been involved. It was as if the town had collectively decided to protect the people responsible for McElroy's death, and in a way, that's exactly what happened. McElroy's murder was a turning point for Skidmore. On one hand, many residents felt a sense of relief. The man who terrorized their community for years was finally gone, and they no longer had to live in fear. But on the other hand, the questions surrounding his death cast a long shadow over the town. Was this an act of vigilante justice carried out by people who believed they had no other choice? Or was it a cold-blooded murder, a case of mob violence that spiraled out of control? To this day, no one has been charged with McElroy's murder, and the case is officially still unsolved. Ken McElroy's death was not just the end of his reign of terror. This became a symbol of the tension between law and order and the concept of frontier justice. It raised difficult questions about what happens when the legal system fails to protect its citizens and whether ordinary people have the right to take the law into their own hands when the system breaks down. This is a real question, guys. It's a question that has divided public opinion for decades and one that continues to haunt the town of Skidmore to this day. And it's a question for everyone. And okay, now that we have laid out the facts, let's dive into the arguments that have emerged in the wake of Ken McElroy's death. This case is unique because on the surface, there isn't a clear prosecution and defense, right? In the traditional sense. No one's been formally charged here with McElroy's murder. No trial ever took place, like we examine in other cases. But in the court of public opinion, there are strong arguments on both sides still. On one side, there are those who believe that McElroy's death was an inevitable and justified act of vigilante justice. And on the other side, there are those who argue that no matter how terrible a person McElroy was, this was still a murder, and those responsible should have been held accountable. So let's start with the argument in favor of what many call vigilante justice. Okay, supporters of this viewpoint, they'll argue that the residents of Skidmore had endured years of harassment, violence, and fear at the hands of Ken, and the legal system had repeatedly failed to protect them. Despite being arrested numerous times, McElroy continued to walk free, often intimidating witnesses into silence or finding legal loopholes to avoid punishment. In the eyes of many, McElroy's death was the only way to put an end to this reign of terror. Those who support this argument often point to the fact that McElroy had committed increasingly violent acts without facing any consequences, nothing serious. By the time he shot grocer Ernest Bowenkamp, the town had already been terrorized by this man for years. He had shot a man in broad daylight. He continued after this to harass the victim and his family, even after being charged with attempted murder. The guy's relentless. And to many, it seemed inevitable that McElroy would eventually kill someone, if not Bowenkamp, then another resident of Skidmore. His return to town, armed and defiant after being released on bail, was seen as the final straw. The people of Skidmore had tried everything within the legal system, and when that failed, they felt they had no other choice but to take justice into their own hands. So from this perspective, McElroy's death is not a murder, guys. This is self-defense on a community-wide scale. The town felt collectively threatened by McElroy, and his killing was seen as the only way to protect themselves from further harm. In fact, some residents have gone so far as to suggest that McElroy's death was a necessary act to prevent further violence, and they argue that the town had been left with no other option. If the legal system could not stop McElroy, then the townspeople had to. We see a lot of cases, well, they're starting to pop up, where even when kids act out violently, their parents are looked into for not holding their kids accountable, shall we say, in some ways. And will there ever be a day where the people actually can hold those with the power accountable? Like in this case, what else could the people have done to stop this? That's what that side is saying. Don't we have a right? We have been failed. What is the cause of this? And they sought it out. But of course, not everyone agrees with this viewpoint, because on the other side of the argument, there are those who believe that vigilante justice, no matter what the circumstances, It's never, ever, ever justified. They argue that McElroy's murder was an unlawful killing, an act of mob violence driven by fear and frustration, rather than any sort of legitimate defense of the community. From this perspective, the residents of Skidmore crossed a line when they took the law into their own hands, and in doing so, they undermined the very principles of justice they claimed to be defending. Critics of vigilante justice argue that no matter how much of a menace McElroy was, he still had a right to a fair trial and due process. And they point out that McElroy had already been convicted for shooting Bellenkamp and was awaiting his appeal when he was killed. If the legal system had been allowed to run its course, they argue that McElroy would have eventually faced justice for his crimes. By taking matters into their own hands, the people of Skidmore robbed McElroy of that process, they say, and in doing so, they became criminals themselves. Those who oppose vigilante justice also point to the fact that no one has ever been charged in connection with this murder. This lack of accountability, they argue, sends a dangerous message. That's an acceptable way to take law into your own hands if you believe that the law and the system have failed you. And that's what I was asking earlier. When do the people have enough? That's what the vigilante people are saying. The other side's saying the law holds up no matter what, because they believe that this sets a troubling precedent, vigilante justice, one that could lead to more acts of violence and lawlessness in the future. After all, if vigilante justice is acceptable in McElroy's case, where do we draw the line? At what point does self-defense become murder? I mean, these laws are out there, guys, and they're changing. In California, it's okay to rob somewhere if it's under a certain amount. What is that doing? Is that this later? Are we going to allow some murders and not? Or how does this work? How do we resolve this? This is the problem with these cases. Beyond the legal arguments, there's that moral question. Was it right for the people of Skidmore to decide McElroy's fate? Do humans of any city or place have a right to feel safe? Where is that line? Supporters of vigilante justice argue that McElroy was a unique case. He was a man who used violence and intimidation to terrorize an entire community, and his death was a way to restore peace, the only way. But critics argue that no individual or group has the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner. Ultimately, the arguments on both sides come down to the question of justice. Was this a righteous retribution act carried out by a town that had been failed by the legal system, or just another case of lawlessness? It's a question that continues to divide public opinion, and one that I ask you, the listeners, to consider as we explore the final pieces of this story. Ken McElroy's death left Skidmore divided, but the controversy surrounding his murder did not end at the town's borders. In fact, this case has continued to spark debates nationwide for decades. The murder of McElroy became more than just a small-town crime. It became a symbol of the tension between justice and revenge, law and vigilante action. What makes this case particularly controversial is the complete silence of the witnesses. Over 40 people. They all saw McElroy get gunned down in broad daylight, but no one came forward. No arrests were made. No charges were filed. And to this day, it's as if the town collectively agreed to let the case go unsolved. Why? Well, some say the silence of Skidmore's residents is a sign that the town was complicit in this death, that they believed justice had been served, and that there was no need for further legal action of any kind. Others argue that the town's silence was driven by more fear. Even after McElroy's death, some of his family members were rumored to still be a threat, particularly his wife, Trina. who claimed she knew the identities of the shooters and she vowed revenge. The fear that McElroy had instilled in Skidmore did not die with him. This is true trauma. And it's possible that the residents' silence was an attempt to protect themselves from more violence and trauma. The media coverage of McElroy's death also played a significant role in shaping the controversy. National outlets picked up the story, painting Skidmore as a town that had taken the law into its own hands. Some portraying the residents as heroes, ordinary people who finally stood up to a bully. Others, obviously critical, right? Condemning the town's actions as dangerous, mob justice. The case even inspired a book and a movie, further cementing its place in the national spotlight. But the more attention the case received, the more lines between justice and revenge were blurred. Another layer of controversy stems from the fact that McElroy's family, particularly his widow, Trina, has insisted for years that this killing was cold-blooded murder. Trina was in the truck with McElroy when he was shot, and she claims that the town had conspired to kill her husband and that the law enforcement, all had turned a blind eye. And she filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the town and the county, accusing local authorities of failing to protect her husband from vigilante justice. While this lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, it did leave many questions unanswered. At the heart of the controversy is the question of whether McElroy's murder was an isolated incident, or is it really a reflection of something deeper, a systemic failure of the legal system to protect the vulnerable? If McElroy's case had been handled differently, could his death have been avoided altogether? And more broadly, what does this case say about the limits of the legal system? When the law fails to deliver justice, does it open the door to vigilantism? Or should citizens continue to sit where they're at and rely on a flawed system with the hope that maybe someday it will eventually work? That's how they felt. This is a case that, it just doesn't have easy answers. On one hand, McElroy was undoubtedly a violent and dangerous man who terrorized a town for years. On the other hand, the way in which his death was carried out raises serious concerns about the rule of law and the consequences of taking justice into your own hands. It is a controversy that has left the legacy of McElroy's death hanging over Skidmore, a town that to this day remains divided over whether they did the right thing. As we wrap up this episode, I'm going to leave you with this final question. Was the killing of Ken McElroy an act of necessary justice? Or was it just an unforgivable crime? The town of Skidmore may never publicly reveal who pulled the trigger, and the legal system may never hold anyone accountable. But in the court of public opinion, this debate rages on. We've heard the arguments, we've seen the facts, and now it's up to you, the listeners, to decide for yourselves. Do you believe that the residents of Skidmore were justified in taking the law into their own hands that day, given the years of terror that they had endured at McElroy's hands? Or do you think that no matter the circumstances, vigilante justice is never the answer? Was this the only way for the town to find peace? Or did they just cross a line? Ultimately, this case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, law, and the gray areas in between. I invite you to weigh the evidence, consider the arguments, and make up your own mind. Was Ken McElroy a victim of mob violence? Or did this guy get exactly what he deserved? Whatever your conclusion, one thing is certain. This case continues to provoke strong emotions and divided opinions even decades later. Thank you for joining me on this journey. through the controversial world of Ken McElroy's death. Stay tuned for more episodes as we continue to explore cases where the lines between right and wrong are not always clear. And as always, stay safe out there, guys. Stay out of trouble. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.